Today I'm going to talk to you about a paper that I wrote with Luke Miller and Jim Wyckoff from the University of Virginia. It's called Performance Screens for School Improvement, the Case of Tenure Reform in New York City. And it addresses the effects of a tenure reform in New York City in 2009-10. And it's part of a long series of projects that we've been doing on teacher labor market policy. In this case, it had become an expectation that teachers would get tenure once they reached the time when they were up for tenure. In general, about 94% of teachers had gotten tenure in 2007 and 2008 when they became eligible. And that's the case even though there had been accountability for a number of years, and you would think that the incentives to give tenure were quite high. The reform in New York City actually didn't change the criteria for giving tenure, which was and continued to be significant professional skill and a meaningful positive impact on student learning. So skill and an effect on student learning was written into the criteria for tenure, but there was very little assessment of that in the tenure process. What was new in 2009-2010 was the use of information, the availability of information for principals to make decisions about tenure, and also some encouragement for principals to think carefully about tenure, more responsibility, and more accountability on the part of principals. So what kind of information did they have available for making tenure decisions at that time? Well, they had the information that was always available, their own classroom observations, their own rankings of the teacher's skills. Those continued to be available. But in addition, there were a series of information that they got on the teacher's effectiveness with students as measured by student learning, either on the state test or in classroom assessments. So they had that additional information, and then they were encouraged to think about that in making a decision and to defend their decision. And that occurred in 2009-10, and in the subsequent years there have been some changes to the policy, but that general emphasis on making use of the information continued. So what happened with this? Well, somewhat surprisingly, I think, given the consistency of the tenure rate, but prior to 2009-10, the rate of teachers getting tenure when they became eligible dropped fairly precipitously. So you can see in the chart that before 2009-10, it was at about a 94% rate. In 2009-10, it dropped in that 1 year to about an 89% tenure rate, and then dropped for the next few years to about 56%. And so it almost halved as a result of just an emphasis on using this information. So what happened to the teachers who did not receive tenure when they became eligible? Well, in fact, the rate of being denied tenure did not increase very much. It increased from about 2 to 3%. So very few teachers before or after the tenure reform were actually denied tenure. Instead, they were extended, meaning that they didn't get tenure, but they were given more years to develop skills. And we can see that could be a reasonable argument that until once the teacher developed skills, then they would receive tenure, but until then they were extended. So what happened to the extended teachers? Does it make any difference, or do they just all stay? Well, in fact, it did end up making a difference, because the teachers who were extended were much, much more likely to leave the system, and actually more likely to switch schools, so maybe they could find a school that was a better fit. So as a result of being extended, it appears that teachers were about 50% more likely, if they were extended, to transfer across schools and find another school than teachers who looked similar but weren't extended, were granted tenure. And similarly, and even more in fact, they were more likely to leave. So the teachers who were extended were about 66% more likely to leave than similar teachers who weren't. So what happened was that the tenure reforms did not actually require teachers to leave, but many of them chose to leave, perhaps because they felt like they were not successful in their jobs. Of course, when teachers leave, you have to think about who's going to replace them. So the next thing that we looked at was who would come in and replace those teachers. It's tricky to get kind of the one-on-one replacement of teachers, but we did the best we could to find who we thought were a reasonable match for the ones who actually replaced the teachers who left. And the reason it's difficult is because teachers move around in schools. So if a third grade teacher left, maybe a second grade teacher came in and took her spot, and then another teacher came in to the second grade. But we took a look at that. And the teachers who came into the schools look substantially more effective than the ones who exited once they were extended. For example, 45 percentage point fewer teachers were rated highly effective or effective of the extended teachers who left relative to the teachers who came into those schools where the extended teachers left. Plus, they were meaningfully more effective. The new teachers were meaningfully more effective as measured by the value they added to students' test performance. Okay, so that's really the heart of the paper, but we also looked separately across different kinds of schools, and not surprisingly, the effects of the reforms were strongest in the most difficult to staff schools. For example, in schools serving more African American students, their teachers were more likely to be extended than in other schools as a result of the policy. However, these differences could be explained by differences in principals' ratings. On average, the teachers were rated lower by the principals in those schools, which caused the change. But given that the teachers who replaced the ones who left after being extended were better, it is likely to have had a bigger effect on difficult to staff schools than on other schools in the system. So that's the paper, and it is called Performance Screens for School Improvement, the Case of Tenure Reform in New York City.